Time to lay down some serious.
He's eating a root of some special sort to sharpen his wits.
Do you know where your teenager is at 5 o'clock in the morning?
Hear the drummer get wicked!
Hey, what's up, everybody? I've never done this before, so I thought I would at least try it out because I'm having a fucking day. And why not meet me under these circumstances? Because we can only go up from here. I'm Vi11ain0u5 J, chef, creator, artist, etc. And I thought I would start a new series that just kind of chronicles a whole bunch of bullshit that you probably don't give a fuck about, but who knows? Maybe you do. And maybe you can find some equal ground knowing that other people might be doing and dealing with the same things you are. So I'm 44. I've been working in the service industry for 30 years. And as of late, I've found that I'm starting to become very disenfranchised with the industry as a whole. For all those out there that are service industry professionals or victims, whatever you want to call yourselves, I'm sure you've kind of known this. I've been doing this since I was 14. So not that you couldn't have done the math once I told you my age, but you get it. When I started, it was in this little jazz club in the west end of Toronto. I'm from Toronto, originally in Canada. For all those who aren't in Canada, Toronto is the biggest and best city in our country. And I had the joy of growing up in it. I had left for a stint and I came back to Toronto and moved in with my dad. Parents are divorced. It's a lot of information to kind of dump on you all at once. Sorry. Probably the best way to get to know somebody is to just have them, dump their life history on you within the first 3 minutes of knowing them. I don't even think we've hit 3 minutes. 2 minutes and 17 seconds. Anyway, I moved in with my dad after living with my mother for most of my life. And he was pretty adamant about me getting a job. And he got me my first job as a busboy at a jazz club. And I worked there for 5.5 years and met some of the coolest people I've ever met. Met my service mentor, who I haven't talked to in years. If you see this, Charles, you were my mentor, and I attribute a great deal of my care for this industry to your tutelage. So you got to kind of picture this. I'm 14. I get a job. I've moved from, one province to another province and back to the other province. I've moved in with my dad. I have never spent much time with the guy, and I get this job. And I've never had a job at this point in time. I walked into a McDonald's once to get a job, and I got the job. They handed me that little prison kit of a shirt, a tag, and I think they had visors at that time. It was like the teal era of the dark teal era of McDonald's. So 93, maybe 1993, 92. I don't remember. And I saw this thing and I was like, it looked like a fucking prison kit. So I was like, no, I'm good. I gotta go. So I never took the job, right? Bummed around like a fucking preteen. So I get this job at this jazz club. I worked there for 5 years, and I don't know if this is my problem or if this isn't everybody who's kind of gotten and fallen in love with the service industry's problem, but I fell hard, and it appealed to me on so many levels, and I got so into it and found I had a huge aptitude for it. And I was really excited by everything that I got to learn and just weird, random skills. Anybody who understands what I'm saying, please comment, just because it would be great to have a conversation about it. Little stupid idiosyncrasies. Things like one thing that I remember resonated heavily was the idea of you never run out of teaspoons during brunch. You also never run out of cream. You can use decaf or regular, just put it in the correct pot. These are things that, today's service industry and back then service industry, so different from a technology point of view, right down to the way the job was approached and the way it was seen by the participants and by the people who came in as guests or customers. Back then, guests didn't become a thing until like the late 90s. So sorry, I digress. I grow up in this really cool city that has really cool shit. And this is pre-smoking bans, so people stayed all night and they drank and they smoked and they were great and they tipped insanely well and things were really, really good. Inventive chefs, inventive restaurants, but even like mom and pop shop sort of pubish like creatures were still really unique. There was no corporate takeover of the world and the industry. It was much more subdued and much more driven by the people who ran the places. And again, they were all kind of one-offs. Sure, there were people who owned multiple restaurants and had different concepts and different styles to them, but it wasn't like it is today where, you know, the minority of business practitioners in the service industry are not non-corporate entities. Most of them are corporate. Most of them are some sort of franchise of a franchise. This is universal. This isn't just Canada. I know this is very pervasive in the States. I'm sure it's more pervasive overseas. I can't imagine the floodgates being held globally behind this shift in the industry. So, but I will speak from my perspective and from a Canadian perspective, and I won't assume, although I'm pretty sure the States is the same. So it was differently. Servers could buy houses on their jobs. You worked in different places. You shifted around the entire environment, from fine dining to casual fine dining to pubbing to club bartending, everything in between. And good servers, these sort of mercenary creatures, would just push into a place, work it until it started to slow down, and then shift out to something else. It wasn't non-committal. They were just experts at what they did. And there was concepts were different back then. We didn't have a massive categorization system for the industry. It wasn't like, again, fine dining, casual fine dining, slight pub fine dining, all of the weird tiers. There were concepts that were specific. If you were serving a lot of pasta and you were Italian centric, you'd probably call your place a trattoria. Bar and grill was big back then. Places were grills that didn't have grills. It just sounded cool. Bistros, restaurants, bars. That was kind of how it worked. And then there were like restaurants where you just knew they had reputation. You're going to pay a lot more and they're going to serve you differently. And it was true back then. You had multiple servers for a single table because each server had a focal point that they had to look at and they had to address, and that was their job. From sommeliering to clearing to making tableside dishes and understanding how you as a server fit into the experience for the diner. This was commonplace. In fact, if you weren't doing this, you probably weren't being pandered. And it wasn't like we had less restaurants. We just had more focused and dedicated people within them. And then this strange thing happened. The smoking ban happened. Now, I'm not shaming health initiatives. I don't want that to be misconstrued. I just think the effects that it had on the service industry, I think, was probably most felt, and it had the most change that came as a result. The first thing that happened in Toronto once the smoking ban kicked in, they gave us a timeline, a certain amount of time that you had to go smoke free or you had to make a decision. So the first stage was you could have smoking, but you had to have it in a smaller section and it had to be away from the non-smokers, and you had to have, I think it was 1/3 of the seating capacity was able to be a smoking place. You could still have all the kids, you could still do all those things, but for that first 6 months period, you had to kind of shrink the smoking area. And then the second move was, if you were going to allow smoking, you weren't allowed to have kids. So right away, they removed families from the dynamic. They were like, no, you can't have kids and smokers in the same space. So we're just going to switch that up and make it so you can't. And that's fair too. The same size smoking section, etc. The workaround in that one was that you could make yourself a private club, have people be members, and then you could have smoking throughout the entire building. No one cared. The next move was to make an actual physically segregated smoking area, which meant that it would had to be like enclosed with its own little ventilation system. Even if it was in like the side pocket of your restaurant or your footprint, if you wanted smoking, this is what you had to do. And this kind of shifted everything away from being able to have smokers in your restaurants, because there's a great deal of restaurants that just can't afford to do that kind of work. The ventilation, the actual paneling, lucite or clear material, whatever you were choosing to do. If it was walled in, all that stuff had to be done, zoned, permitted, etc. So it wasn't like it was a cheap thing. It was an automatic deterrent for most businesses to keep smoking. And after that, it became no smoking at all. And you could smoke outside, and then they sort of have piled the rules on top. I hope I'm not sounding like I'm shaming this, because it was the right thing to do. But as a result of this, something happened. And I don't think we saw it coming, because there was a natural sort of in now, because the restaurant industry started to hurt because of this. People didn't stay as long. People didn't drink as much. People weren't inclined to be a participant in the restaurant industry as heavily as they used to be. Didn't mean it was hurting yet. It just meant that it was starting to wean. And one of the major focuses, one of the biggest problems was most restaurants didn't care what time of night or what day or what you were doing. People, if you want to bring your kids, bring your kids. They eat off the menu. There were no kids menus. There were kitschy places that had that, and like very kid driven. One of the big ones in Toronto was the Old Spaghetti Factory. It was like a kid's restaurant, big arcades, spaces for kids to fuck around, and a kids menu, and a menu very built towards kids. But it wasn't like every restaurant and every bar and every pub had a kids menu. It was it just didn't happen. So because of this sort of hole that was created by the smoking ban, and because a lot of these places weren't really outfitted for kids, corporations started to realize that they could take spots. I'm not going to say I know which one was first. I don't know. I just know what I experienced. And please understand, I'm not a historian. I haven't done research on this. This is just straight conjecture based on my lived experience of 30 years in the same industry. So take it for what it's worth. You think I'm bullshit? Tell me. Like, seriously, tell me. I'd love to hear it. So sorry about the ums. I'll work on that. So corporations realize that most restaurants, most bars, most pubs are not built for families, and specifically families. And now with the smoking ban, families start to become a huge marketable property. So you get all these corporate little shops popping up into real estate in the downtown core of Toronto. They first start to take out the perimeter of Toronto. So bedroom communities like, I'm going to say a bunch of places. And if you're not from Toronto, I apologize. But just how about this? You got a city, it's in the middle, right? Lots of space, lots of people, blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, you've got like little sub-cities that are outside of the big city, boroughs or suburbs or whatever kitschy name they have for it. These were the spaces that were starting to heavily develop. So box malls became a thing. And within every box mall, as I'm sure you know, you've got some sort of kitschy corporate franchise, probably a few. In the early days for Canada, specifically in this point, you have things like RD's Ribs and Blues, or RD's or Red Devils. They were a big one. Casey's and Kelsey's, two different companies, same kind of idea. Lone Star, and then American corporations and American shops popped in, right? But the reality was a lot of them were outside of the city core. In fact, it was really hard for them to get into the core until that switch happened, when you had a market and then real estate became cheap because you're a corporation and you're making lots of money. So you can buy pieces of buildings. I'm sure most people who are from cities know what I'm talking about. For those who don't live in cities or have never been to one, I don't know if that works. Office towers, there's some sort of space in them, whether it be in a sub basement or on a first floor, where they started to build out spaces for restaurants. And that was a huge part of it. And corporations took that spot and ate it up. So now you've got a whole bunch of new corporate shops that are starting to create a new ethos. And that ethos is the idea of the McDonald's model, not in terms of fast food, but efficient food, and geared entirely towards the idea that no matter which one you go to, you're going to have the same experience. This starts to train people. I'm sure you know this. I'm sure you've experienced it. If you haven't, think about it. Think really hard. If you're in a really corporate heavy restaurant market, you've probably already started to or have been trained into this sort of ethos of each place is the same, so I can trust it. If I can trust it, then I should go there rather than taking the chance. In the early days, that wasn't so much the case. It was a combination of comfort in its efficiency, commonality, and the understanding that you get it, and of course, affordability. And this was another start and change and trend that was very pushed against by most restaurants that were not corporate, was this idea of larger portions and value being displayed on a plate. Most restaurants sort of drove the idea prior to this time of experience, and the experience of being in this restaurant is what really should stand out, and therefore that's what you're paying for, plus the quality food, plus the quality service, etc. The corporate sort of model switched that a little bit and said, no, you're paying for what's on the plate, you're paying for it to come to you quickly, consistently, and you're paying for it so that you can get in and out, but still enjoy whatever you're having. And of course, you can bring your kids. And with that came this idea of pandering towards kids. So yes, kids menus, very, very much a huge thing. And again, it's training the people. Prior to this, you didn't have families coming into restaurants expecting a kids menu. They just made their kids eat off the menu. After this, if you didn't have some sort of weird kids menu section, especially in pubs or resto bars, whatever they call them, places where you find more families that were casually dressed. Yes, back before the days of now, we really tiered restaurants on how you were expected to look when you entered them. So if you had to dress up real nice, like it was a fancy place, and the fancy place was more expensive, period, all stop. Servers dressed accordingly. The spaces were clean and modern and sleek, etc. And that was what you got. And in this case, it's more of that idea of if you could casually dress with your family and you could get in and out in 45 minutes and you could spend about $45 a head, you were winning the day. And please understand that the prices might vary based on the fact that a large amount of this is, again, in the 90s, right? So this shift happens, and it's been this sort of consistent grind that has been sort of tearing apart the fabric of what I like to think of as the most indelible aspects of the service industry, this idea of driving experience and doing things that you couldn't do at your house. And it seems like people now have been engineered into this idea that I should go out for things I can do at my house, but I'm just not inclined to do it. And that's very weird to me. And I think that weirdness comes from my longevity in the industry and where my passion stems from in it. And therein lies the biggest problem, because I find myself in the modern day that the minority now is very much the experience-driven concepts. And the majority are the, it's not fast food. It's just, they're feederees. Does that make sense? It's as if you're driven to feed there, not experience, not even relax, just feed and get the fuck out. It's showcased in a lot of the changes in which happened when it came to staffing in restaurants. Previous to the corporate takeover time, early 90s, right into like the late 90s, you've got smaller staffs with bigger sections. So I remember my first pub, and I had, you'd start off with a small section of like 12 tables. And the better you got, you weren't really driving back then for like your hours. And I imagine you still don't today, but back then it was sections. And sections and how many sections you could eat up. Because the more sections you got, the more people you got, the more people you got, the more money you made. Because no one worked for their hourly wage. I mean, my first hourly wage, I think, was $7. I think I got to 8 5 years in. This is minimum wage was terrible, and no one paid well hourly, but they gave you shifts. They gave you the hours, and the hours that were in prime shifts. And if you got prime shifts, you were making cheddar cheese. And I remember this one pub I was working at, you would start off with like a 12 person table or 12 table section, excuse me. And then as they cut down, you'd literally start eating up average 12 table sections. Now, of course, you're slowing down, the day's slowing, but I was the guy who would just be like, I want to take all of the sections, like either cut me or cut 2 people, because this sucks. I don't get paid to stand. And that, it sounds greedy as fuck, I admit it. But it wasn't about being greedy. It was about being honest about what you were there for. And this didn't change the way you served. I mean, ironically enough, most servers had a style. Sure, you had to hit these points on the grid. 2 bites, 2 minutes, or, your quality checks, as they say today. You'd have to do your table touchings for your sections. You'd clear, you'd break down, you'd do your side duties, you'd do your flips. Like, all of these things haven't changed. They may have changed the names, but the characters are all the same. No, you just worked harder to get better, because with that came more money. And the corporate model changed that. You started seeing smaller sections and more servers and more support staff and kind of unnecessary support staff. Like, they would overstaff their restaurants. I've noticed that a large amount of corporate restaurants have kind of relaxed on that over the course of the last 10 years, but predominantly it was really bad. And what was really, really bad about it was their hiring practices and their training methodologies. A large amount of these places didn't train, and they also didn't have people who had been in the industry, salty, cagey veterans, to sort of walk people through. In fact, it was very manual and very corporate. And therein lies one of the biggest problems, is this disconnect. I opened with thanking my mentor. And then I told you a couple of silly, goofy rules that just stick with me, and the tools that you build. But a large amount of this was a guy working with me. Now, yes, arguably he did this so that I was better, so that he didn't have to support me as much, which made it easier for him to make money. And it also allowed me to be more self-sufficient. If you want to look at it from a selfish perspective, go for it. That's still valid. From my perspective, it was building me into a better server because he wanted to see me succeed. And with that mentality, with that unselfish need to enrich another person with what they had learned, that apprenticeship concept really pushed me into a better position, and it made me want to do it with other people. That kind of pay it forward concept, that was very, very commonplace amongst those who you became close with in the industry. And these people are like summer or like high school friends or summer camp friends. You only have them really in the time you work together. Past that, a large amount of these people disappear into the ether. That was for me. Again, not judging other people who have had sustained relationships with their coworkers. A large amount of my front of house acquaintances, I don't know anymore. My kitchen life is very different, but the front of house stuff really started me on that track towards where I am today. So going backwards to what I had sort of been rambling about, this notion that people are being trained. And I think today we see the fruits of those labors so much more, because again, the marketplace is saturated with these corporate experiences that aren't really driven by experience, but driven by efficiency and value. And diners by and large have changed as a result of these changes. And I'm sure you can sort of speak for yourselves. If you go to a lot of corporate restaurants, perhaps you're in a market where that's really the only options you have, or maybe that's just something you enjoy better. You'll probably notice a couple of weird things. One, next time you go to a corporate restaurant, sit down, or any restaurant, count in your head how long it takes you to decide what you're going to have right away. This is before you've even had a drink. This is probably before you've even seen your server. I'm going to guess that there's a larger amount of you that immediately hit that menu and try to figure it out as fast as possible. Either that or you've gone to this place so frequently that you already know. Okay, so why do you do that? Some people would just say, I like to be prepared. But if everybody, or if there's a majority of us that do it, then the question becomes, why do we all do it? You can't excuse this behavior just by saying, well, I do it because it does X. No, there's got to be a reason that you can tie these things together. And I think the main reason is that you know you're going to be strategically neglected by your server. Now, okay, why do I say this? We'll go back to the section concept. If I have 12 tables of 2, I have 24 guests at a given time. Now, you can swish this all around and change the numbers, but we're going to say it's 12 tables of 2 that makes 24 people. If every section has 24 people, the possibility of 24 people, then each person is responsible for 24 of the guests that are in a restaurant at a given time. Now, most restaurants range between 50 seats on the low end, and I'm not going to add the super restaurants. Let's just call the average 200. So you're going from 50 to 200, right? If it's 50 people, then in the old days, you'd have 2 servers, 1 host, and a bartender. On busy days, you'd have 2 bartenders and maybe a busser. But that's it. That's what you have. That's a 50-seater, two groups of 24, okay, 2 groups of 25, and that's what you got. In today's day and age, 50-seaters are not very commonplace, but most of them are overstaffed with far too many people. But corporate restaurants don't go with 50 seats. It's not profitable. How can you do the things that you need to do to make the lots of the monies if you've only got 50 people to play with? So you add, another 150 seats to that, and now you're up to 200 seats, right? So if we divide the 200 by the 12, and all that math and shit, back in the day, you'd likely have 1 server for every 24 people, right? So in the case of 200, let's go 1 server for every 25 people, right? So we have 8 servers. And at that point in time, you'd have some support staff, maybe a couple bussers, and then 2 bartenders. 1 a service bartender and 1 a bartender who deals with the actual rail where people sit, which was, again, pretty commonplace back in the day, more so then than it probably is today. That's how it was structured. In today's world, you're likely looking at 6 table sections. So, we've already done it by 12 tables equals 24. And 6 is 12, right? So you're doubling your staff, and you're likely going to have more staff that support, plus managers, plus supervisors. Oh, by the way, managers, 1, they wouldn't stay for the whole day. They'd probably bugger off at the early stage of the first rush. And you had like some sort of anointed monkey who got tapped and said, okay, today you get the conch, make sure no one fucks up. Like that's how it was. We weren't manager heavy back then. It just wasn't a thing because, again, it maximizes profitability if you have experts that do their jobs and don't need to be overseen by everything. And a large amount of us didn't need oversight. We were good. There was no POSs. Most of this crap was handwritten. There was the infancy of POSs, like the squirrel machine, which had like a punch card and had an insane amount of PLUs that you had to memorize. But none of this touch screen. Everything does the work for you. You had to add up your crap. You had to stick it into a shitty cash register. And it was just the way it was done. So everybody kind of was just responsible because that's how you survived in the industry. In today's day and age, it's a little different. I'm not shaming technology. POS systems are fucking glorious. I don't want PLUs. In fact, I don't think that back in the day was better when it came to the technology of our business. In fact, I think it sucked and it was fucking archaic. So for that, I commend the POS system and technology and in technology being integrated into the service industry. It's good shit. What I do have a problem with, however, is how we stopped looking at what we did in a caring way, caring enough that we sustained this apprenticeship cycle. Sure, yes, a large amount of servers were doing other things. It afforded you the ability to pick and choose things that you wanted and then go do other things. Actors, writers, artists, etc. Very commonplace. But then you get into just today's day and age where everything's scaled younger, right? Like I was an enigma in the industry being as young as I was when I started. Most people weren't. Most people who were making really good money and were getting really good shifts and really again, back to that mercenary concept, we're not young, so it wasn't a young person's game. You also didn't just get to do stuff in restaurants back in the day. It wasn't like you just got the job. You didn't interview as a server unless you were a server. You weren't going to get onto a floor in your first day in the service industry, no matter how good you looked. You had two options: host, busser. Busser, barback, same deal. Same thing, just different department. But that was it. You were a host or you were a busser. If you wanted to be in the kitchen, you were a dishwasher. That's your start. And you were on your knees cleaning up puke, and you were cleaning underneath bar fridges, and you were running around like a fucking chicken with your head cut off, and everybody treated you like shit because you were the person who was there to do the shitty work. You just did. That was it. Most places didn't have a lot of them, which meant you got good hours. And at the end of it, you got tipped out, and you got tipped out by people who weren't looking at some sort of, percentage sheet. They were like, tonight I made X, you get Y. Some people were shitty tippers, so you did less for them. Some people were amazing tippers, and you did more for them. There wasn't an inherent percentage. It was just like, you do this, you do well for me, I pay you well, everybody wins. And you just gradually learned and got better and learned and got better. And finally, someone, probably an owner or a manager, looks over and goes, you get a section, fucko. And there you go. Or you get to take a service bar spot. For all those who don't know what a service bar is, main bar, service bar. Main bar, pandering to the guests that are there. People come up, you're talking to them, you're selling them shit. Service bar services the floor staff. So if a server needed a beer, the service bartender would deal with it, not the main bartender. This, of course, is in places that required it. Not everywhere had a service bar. Not everywhere needed a bartender to get you your drinks. There's a lot of bars I worked at where you just did your own shit, but it all depends on the structure. But this was kind of very commonplace. And again, a stepping stone. You host, you get on the floor. You dish pit, you get to the prep space. Like, all of these things had these natural progressions. No one got to skip the line. Okay, I say that. People got to skip the line, but it wasn't like you were skipping the line just because. It was either probably nepotism or it was skill. Like, or a manager or an owner saw something and said, I want you on my floor. That was not uncommon. It's very uncommon now to have to do the latter. In fact, most places, corporate places specifically, will do your interview and judge that and use that as the reason to put you in a spot. There's no intuition, there's no discussion. It's very judgmental, and it's very much based on your resume, not on how you present. And certainly not about going, okay, well, can I take this person from X to Y to Z? So I think that diminishes the passion and the craftsman or craftsperson, ship that goes into the service of the service industry. The corporate re-engineering of the guest experience, training all of you. Sorry, we'll circle back to the whole why you probably rush your order. Going back to that idea of reframing the narrative, as it were, of why are you here? Well, you're here for efficiency, you're here for consistency, and you're here to pay what's being put in front of you. The experience is starting to slide away. If anything, the experience was very gimmick driven. Bars were no longer sports bars, because we did have sports bars, and then we had pubs. Pubs started having TVs. Sports bars had TVs already. Everybody showed the game. Again, this assault of the space to keep you mentally occupied for a short period of time. All of these things that are so normalized today were very abnormal in what I like to think of as the halcyon days of the service industry. And it's baffling to me that we're not more self-aware of how it's shifted. I mean, you're ushered into your corporate seat. You're given your giant mega corporate menu. You, as a human being, probably understand, as I do, how can all of these items be done correctly, consistently? if they're complicated or interesting. We can't subvert logic all the time to think that that's sustainable and profitable. So the only answer when you look at something like this has to be in your mind that I'm sacrificing something in this equation, and that sacrifice is likely, well, the quality of what I'm eating. And then you look at it from the same direction when it comes to the service of the space, the pricing of the space, the way in which you're being regarded as a guest. You're no longer valued because you're a timestamp. I like to call it the 45-minute shuffle. And this goes right back to what I was asking of when you go and sit down in a restaurant, how long does it take you to make your decision on what you want in totality? Not what you want to drink, and then we'll get there, but in totality. And I imagine there's two reasons why you rush it. One, you've been trained to do this. As I said, it's the 45-minute shuffle. A corporation does not make money off of giving you valued food and valued service with a slightly lower markup unless it's doing one thing really well, which is rotating or flipping your table. So if you do some more math and you look at how many people can fit into a restaurant, how long it takes for the food to be created, be served, for them to consume it, and then leave, the average is about 45 minutes. If everybody's paying $30 a head and it's two people, you're making $60. Call it 70. Call the average spend is $70 per person. If I'm making $70 per person, but you're sitting there for 2 hours, well, I'm not making that much money. Because remember, $70 per person is really not indicative of how much money is being made by the establishment. What's being made by the establishment is a percentage of that sale. I'm sure you understand this. Beyond the taxes, etc., there's the percentage to the floor or to the staff, the percentage to the food or the cost of the food, including the cost of making that food, the percentage that goes to the upkeep and the general needs for supplies, that's bar stuff, small wares, etc. Most owners get about 2 cents on the dollar. It's shit money. But the reality is, in order to maximize that number, I have to make sure all of the percentages around that stay low. I have to maximize as much of the profitability without marking it up to move myself out of the market. And I have to flip tables, because flipping tables means constant rotation. So if I'm flipping the table every 45 minutes and I have 200 seats and I'm making these rotations consistently, how do I do that and maintain that speed and pace? Well, I put more staff on, because then I have faster micro moments, less monopolization of the staff member. I can move the food more efficiently if I have an efficient menu program, or if I have something simple and requires less steps. At some point in the future, I'll talk about how chefs have to engineer dishes by looking at them in fragmented steps rather than pretending it's cooking. Listen, at restaurants, you don't cook, you replicate. All the brain power is done well before the doors open and well before you sit down. If it's not, then I don't know what the fuck we're doing here. So if I'm doing all these things, I need everybody to get in line. I need you to have this in your mind when you walk in the door. And this is regardless of whether or not we are slammed or if we're dead. Because the fastest way for me to get what I want is to get you to do what I want you to do without thinking about doing it. Now, if you spend, well, about 30 or 28 years or 25 years trying and building out this training program where you're training people to accept this as being normalized, then the battle's already won. So why do you immediately look at that menu and get that answer as quick as humanly possible? In most restaurants, there's probably a small percentage of restaurants where you're encouraged not to do that by a server who's probably worth their salt and understands that the longer you sit there, the more money you're likely to spend. This is not the corporate way. This is the smart way. The corporate way wants to make sure it's consistently making profit, and this is the best way to do it. Take shit out of bags, stick it into a bowl, give you a hell of a lot of it, push you as hard as I can to spend the average, and get you the fuck out of the way so you can get another table in. So if you sit down at your next restaurant and you look and you say, hey, I need to get this answer out as fast as humanly possible because I know I'm not going to be taken care of. I'm not going to be regarded with any care. And quite frankly, I don't want to wait. I don't want to wait for my server to forget me. I don't want to wait for the strategic neglect that they've all been trained to do. I don't want that. I just want to get my X so I can get my Y, so I can get my kids and my family back in the car and get the fuck home. Now, that to me does not compute at all. That to me is drive through without a car. That to me is the corrosion of the service industry and why we do it. It just seems so fucked. It's fucked. And I've watched this happening over a few years, well, most of my life, and there's nothing that I can do, or at least I don't think there is. It's weird caring and loving something as much as you can, seeing other people tear it apart, watching people condone it, and being powerless to do anything about it. It's a shame. I'm Villainous J, and I look forward to chatting again. Thanks, guys. If you enjoyed this chat, don't forget to like and subscribe and do all the fun YouTube things. It certainly keeps me motivated to create cool content, and I welcome some comments. So jump right in there and start our discussion.